The Autumn Decay, based on true events. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 25 years old, and I'm alive only because of decisions I made in moments of clarity during what should have been my death. What happened to me in the autumn mountains of Colorado shouldn't be possible. But I'm telling you anyway, because there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to acknowledge. And if you venture into the wild, you deserve to know what might be waiting for you there. It started with optimism. Foolish, youthful optimism. October in the Rocky Mountains is the time when people flock to Instagram-worthy locations to photograph the autumn foliage at peak color. I'd planned my expedition for the tail end of autumn, after the crowds had dispersed but before the heavy snows arrived. I wanted solitude among the aspens, that rare moment when nature puts on its most spectacular show and no one is around to witness it. I was an experienced hiker with a good track record. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. I started my solo expedition on October 10th, from a trailhead in the San Juan Mountains. My plan was ambitious. A 14-day loop through some of the most remote territory in the region. Unlike my planned route the previous year, I was careful this time. I'd filed detailed trip reports, checked in with multiple people, and worked with the ranger's office. I had satellite communication, multiple maps, proper equipment, and enough experience that I genuinely believed I'd be fine. The first week was perfect. The weather held. The aspens blazed with color. I saw elk, mule deer, mountain goats. The trail was well maintained. The nights were cold but manageable. And for the first time in my hiking career, I felt genuinely at peace with myself and the world. I kept a video journal that week, recording short clips on my phone to share with my followers later. I was living the dream. Then came October 17th, the day everything changed. I'd noticed it the morning before. The animals had gotten weird. The squirrels and chipmunks that were normally abundant had vanished. The bird calls had stopped. The forest had that same suffocating silence I'd experienced during my previous encounter with something that shouldn't exist. I recognized it immediately, and it terrified me. But when I checked my maps and my position, I was still on a well-established trail, still in areas that were regularly used by hikers and park rangers. How could anything truly dangerous be here? I was being paranoid, I told myself. My previous trauma was making me see threats that didn't exist. So I kept hiking. By afternoon, the weather had turned ugly in a way that was forecasted as minimal. The sky took on a sickly greenish-gray color, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The wind came up suddenly, not the gentle autumn breeze I'd anticipated, but powerful gusts that made walking difficult. And with the wind came a smell, organic and wrong, like something decomposing in the high heat, even though it was cold. I decided to make camp early, setting up at a place where the trail crossed a small clearing near an alpine meadow. The meadow was unusual for the location. It shouldn't exist here according to my maps. But I was tired, the weather was deteriorating, and I wanted the security of open ground around me rather than being surrounded by dense trees. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and tried to establish a routine that would calm my nerves. The first sign that I wasn't alone came as darkness fell. I was sitting just outside my tent, boiling water for a freeze-dried meal, when I noticed the deer. Not just any deer, the same doe I'd seen 2 years ago during my previous encounter. I know this because it had a distinctive scar on its left flank, a long gash that looked like it had been made by something with claws. The deer was standing at the edge of my clearing, staring at me with an expression that I could only describe as knowing. It watched me for several minutes, and I watched it back. Then, without breaking eye contact, it deliberately turned and walked into the meadow behind my tent. I followed it. I know how that sounds, but the familiarity of this moment, the fact that this was exactly how my previous encounter had started, filled me with a sense of urgent curiosity mixed with dread. I had to understand what was happening. I had to know if I was experiencing genuine danger or if my trauma was manifesting as patterns where none existed. The meadow was strange. In the fading light, I could see the grass was an unusual color. Not quite brown, not quite yellow, but something sickly in between. The ground felt soft and gave way slightly beneath my boots, like walking on something decomposing. And as my eyes adjusted, I realized that the meadow wasn't entirely composed of grass. Mixed throughout were the remains of animals. Bones mostly scattered everywhere, bleached white, arranged almost deliberately. Skulls of elk, the ribs of deer, Smaller remains I couldn't immediately identify. Hundreds of skeletal remains, perhaps thousands, all arranged in patterns that suggested intention rather than natural death. The doe had disappeared into the darkness beyond the meadow. I stood there, staring at this charnel house, and my mind refused to process what I was looking at. This shouldn't exist. These animals shouldn't all be dead. There was no reason for this concentration of death in this specific location. That's when I heard the howl. It started low, a mournful sound that seemed to come from the ground beneath my feet rather than from the sky above. It rose in pitch, becoming something that was almost a scream, almost human, almost animal, almost something else entirely. Other voices joined it. Multiple creatures, all howling in unison. A sound so discordant and wrong that my hearing felt like it was distorting. The howling surrounded me, coming from every direction, and I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever had allowed me to survive 2 years ago was no longer interested in allowing me anything except the maximum amount of suffering. I ran back to my tent. I don't remember the run itself. My mind had gone into a state of pure panic. I remember reaching my tent and diving inside, fumbling for my bear spray and my knife and my satellite communicator, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon. I sealed the tent as best as I could and huddled in the darkness, listening. The howling stopped, replaced by something worse. Movement around my tent. Circling. Multiple things, multiple voices. I could hear them communicating with each other. Clicking sounds, half-formed words, and sometimes what almost sounded like laughter. They weren't trying to hide from me. They wanted me to know they were there. Then the smell hit. It came through the ventilation of my tent like a physical force. The smell of rot and ancient decay, of something that had died and been left in the sun to fester. But beneath it was something else. A chemical smell, acrid and wrong, that made my eyes water. The smell seemed to carry something with it, not visible but felt, a sickness that filled my lungs with each breath. One of the creatures pressed against the side of my tent. I could see the outline of something massive against the fabric, far too large to be any normal animal. It sniffed along the tent wall, breathing heavily, taking in my scent. I was holding my breath, every muscle in my body locked rigid, certain that if I moved even a millimeter, everything would explode into violence. The thing moved to the tent entrance. I could hear it fumbling with the zipper, and yes, it was deliberately trying to open my tent, understanding exactly how the mechanism worked. The zipper moved down a few inches, then stopped. I realized the creature was taking its time, toying with me, enjoying the knowledge of my terror. I moved. I lunged for the zipper and pulled it up as hard as I could, sealing the tent again. At the exact same moment, I jabbed the bear spray toward the opening. The creature shrieked, that sound that existed between animal and human, and I heard it thrashing backward. But it was just for a moment. Seconds later, it was back, this time trying to tear through the tent fabric itself. The tent ripped, not gradually, but in a massive tear as something with strength I couldn't comprehend shredded the synthetic material like paper. I could see shapes now in the darkness outside. At least 3 distinct massive forms, moving with predatory grace around my tent. I didn't think. I just moved on pure survival instinct. I grabbed my pack with everything crucial inside it, my communicator, my knife, my water purification tablets, a first aid kit, 1 energy bar, and I dove out of the tent through the damaged wall away from the creatures. I ran into the darkness of the meadow. What followed was a nightmare that exists in fragmented pieces in my memory. I ran through the bone-littered meadow, hearing the creatures pursuing me. But they weren't just hunting me, they were hurting me. Whenever I tried to change direction, one would appear, forcing me to continue in a specific direction. They were driving me somewhere. I crashed into the forest. The darkness was absolute, my flashlight barely penetrating the gloom of the dense trees. Behind me, I could hear the things moving through the forest with impossible speed, communicating with each other in clicks and half-formed sounds. The chase went on and on. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed. But the creatures never got closer. They never made a move to attack. They just kept driving me forward, deeper and deeper into the forest. Then I burst into a clearing, and I stopped dead. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree. It was ancient, easily 500 years old, with a trunk so thick that 20 people holding hands couldn't circle it. But what made me stop was what covered the tree: human remains. skeletons and partially decomposed bodies, hanging from the branches by what looked like vines but might have been something else entirely. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, men, women, children, all in various states of decay, all hanging from that single, impossible tree. And as I stood there, staring at this nightmare-made flesh, I heard voices. They came from the bodies. Each skeleton, each corpse, each pile of decomposing remains started to speak. Not with mouths. Most of them didn't have mouths anymore, but with voices that seemed to emanate from the bodies themselves. They spoke in a chorus, 1,000 overlapping voices, all saying the same thing. Join us, join us, join us, join us. The sound was hypnotic. I felt my legs moving toward the tree even as my conscious mind screamed at me to run. There was something in that chorus, something that seemed to tunnel directly into my brain, that wanted me to walk to that tree and hang myself from those branches and join that horrible collective voice. I was 5 steps away when something broke through the forest behind me. It was different from the other creatures. Larger, more defined, more conscious. It moved with an almost human gait, but with proportions that were all wrong, limbs too long, spine curved in ways vertebrae shouldn't curve. And its face, when I caught a glimpse of it in the moonlight that suddenly broke through the clouds, its face was familiar. It was my father. My father had died when I was 12 years old. I knew every line of his face, every expression, every mannerism. This thing had captured all of that perfectly. It was wearing him like a suit, understanding every movement, every gesture. And it was smiling at me with my father's smile. Sarah, it said with my father's voice. It's been so long since I've seen you. Come here, baby. Come here with me. The tree voices grew louder. The thing wearing my father's skin reached out toward me. And I did something that I'm still not sure how I managed. I ran. Not toward the creatures. Not toward the tree. But perpendicular to everything. Crashing through the forest with my father's voice calling after me. Begging me to come back. Using words and memories and moments of tenderness that no creature should have known. I ran until my body simply couldn't run anymore. Hours passed. The forest changed around me. The trees grew thinner, the density of the woodland shifting. At some point, the pursuing sounds stopped, or I simply got far enough away that I couldn't hear them anymore. I had no idea what time it was or how far I'd traveled or where I was going. I was operating on pure instinct, following what I thought was a downhill trajectory, hoping that eventually I'd reach civilization or at least a river that I could follow to safety. The sun came up around 6 a.m. The light was weak and gray, filtered through a haze that seemed to obscure the sky. But it was light and I could see. I realized I was in a part of the forest that looked dying. The trees were skeletal, most of their leaves already fallen, creating a ground cover that was wet and rotting. The air smelled like decay. And as I looked more closely, I realized that the trees weren't just dying. They were wrong. The bark had a consistency that looked almost like skin. The branches were configured in ways that suggested intention. And the overall shape of the forest suggested intentional design rather than natural growth. That's when I saw the structure. It was built into the hillside, a massive structure made of bone and wood and materials I couldn't identify. At first, I thought it might be natural, a massive rock formation or geological anomaly. But as I got closer, I could see that it was constructed, deliberately built. The entrance was a gaping mouth in the hillside, large enough for me to stand inside without crouching. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to go in. But I was exhausted, dehydrated, and the forest around me felt increasingly hostile. The structure at least offered shelter. It offered the possibility that inside, I might find something that could help me. Or I might find nothing and be able to rest for a moment. I was so desperately tired. I approached the entrance carefully. The interior was dark, but not so dark that I couldn't see a few feet inside. The walls appeared to be carved stone, smooth and deliberately shaped, and there was a passage leading deeper into the earth. Without thinking clearly, I don't know if I was even capable of clear thought at that point, I entered the structure. The passage sloped downward. As I walked, the air grew warmer and the smell of decay grew stronger. I could see markings on the walls, shapes that might have been writing or might have been something else entirely. They were old, very old. The kind of old that spoke of centuries, perhaps millennia of previous use. The passage opened into a chamber. What I saw in that chamber still visits me in nightmares. The walls were covered in everything. Pelts, human skin, tanned and treated like leather, covering the walls in a patchwork quilt. Bones arranged in patterns. Objects that I recognized, a wedding ring, a watch, a child's toy. But most disturbing were the faces. Dozens of faces, preserved somehow, I don't want to know how, arranged on the walls like masks in an exhibition. They were all different. Different ages, different features. But all of them shared one thing. They were all looking at me. All of them, despite being preserved faces detached from their owners, seemed to be watching me. And I understood exactly what this place was. It was a collection, a museum of victims, a trophy room for something that had been collecting human remains for longer than I could possibly imagine. I stumbled backward out of the chamber, gagging and retching, my mind unable to fully process the horror of what I'd seen. I ran back up the passage toward the entrance, not caring if I made noise, not caring if anything was waiting for me outside. I just needed to be away from that place. I burst out of the entrance into the gray daylight and I collapsed. For several minutes, I couldn't do anything except lie in the dirt and shake. My body was shutting down. I was dehydrated, exhausted, probably going into shock. The sun was high in the sky now. I'd been moving through the night without rest, and I had no idea what time it was or how long I'd been missing or if anyone was even looking for me yet. Then I heard voices, human voices, speaking English, the sound of an engine. I lifted my head and saw them. A group of park rangers with ATVs, moving through the forest with purpose and organization. They'd found me. Somehow, impossibly, they'd found me. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't work properly. I tried to shout, but my voice came out as a croak. I waved my arms, and one of the rangers pointed and said something to the others. They came running toward me. I passed out before they reached me. When I woke up, I was in a hospital in Durango. The rangers explained that my satellite communicator had sent out a distress signal at 3 a.m. They'd been searching for me based on my last known position and had found me nearly 5 miles from where my signal had been transmitted. I'd wandered into difficult terrain, they said. The weather had been bad. I'd gotten lost. I was lucky to be alive. I didn't tell them about the creatures. I didn't tell them about the tree or the bone structure or the chamber of horrors. I knew exactly how that would sound. I'd been hospitalized before for psychiatric evaluation after my first encounter with something impossible. I wasn't going to repeat that experience. So instead, I told them about the weather turning bad and me getting disoriented and searching for shelter. The doctors found me in good condition considering the circumstances. Dehydrated, exhausted, with some cuts and bruises, but otherwise intact. No signs of exposure-related injuries. No serious trauma markers. Just a young woman who'd gotten lost hiking and had been found by competent rescuers. My psychiatric evaluation was brief and concluded that I was psychologically healthy, that my account of events was consistent with actual trail conditions, and that there was no evidence of delusion or psychological disturbance. I was cleared to go home after 48 hours of observation. But there was one thing the doctors found unusual: my satellite communicator. They showed it to me, asking how I'd managed to send a distress signal. I hadn't. I didn't even know my communicator was in my pack. The last time I consciously accessed it was when I was setting up my initial camp. The ranger said that the signal it sent was a standard distress beacon, the kind that gets triggered if the device is activated manually. But the device had been sealed inside my pack, under several layers of equipment that would have taken several minutes to sort through in order to access. Someone, or something, had deliberately activated my communicator. The rangers had assumed it was me, a conscious decision to call for help. But I knew better, and the implications of that knowledge terrified me in a way that nothing else had. Whatever had been hunting me hadn't wanted me dead. It had wanted me to be found. It had wanted me to survive. And it had orchestrated my rescue as deliberately as it had orchestrated my capture. That was worse than death. Death was an ending. This was something far more sinister. This was being part of something, a game that I didn't understand and couldn't escape. This was the knowledge that somewhere in the forest, something was watching and waiting and had decided I had a purpose in its existence. I went through the motions of recovery. I was debriefed by the Park Service. I submitted formal accounts of my hiking experience. I answered questions about trail conditions and weather patterns and my own skill level and judgment. No one asked me about the impossible things. No one asked me about the creatures or the tree or what I'd found in that structure, because those things couldn't possibly be real. But I knew what I'd seen. 2 years have passed since that October encounter. I haven't returned to the mountains. Not even once. I've taken vacations to places like Costa Rica and Guatemala, but I can't bring myself to return to the wilderness of my home state. The worst part isn't the memories, although those are bad enough. The worst part is knowing that I'm connected to something now, that something made a deliberate choice to let me live. And in my darkest moments, I wonder why. Was I marked in some way? Was I chosen for a purpose that I haven't yet served? Does it have plans for me, knowing where I live, knowing my name, knowing exactly how to find me? I've done research just like after my first encounter. I've learned about skinwalkers and similar creatures from various cultures. I've learned about things that exist in folklore and indigenous traditions, warnings passed down through generations about dangers that modern society has dismissed as superstition. The Ute people who inhabited these mountains left stories. Stories about things that wear human skin, things that collect bodies, things that exist in the liminal spaces between death and life, between human and animal, between what we know and what we refuse to acknowledge. I ignored those stories. I hiked into territories where indigenous peoples had left warnings, thinking I was above the need to respect those boundaries, thinking that my training and my experience and my confidence were enough to overcome anything that nature could present. I was spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. The scariest part about what happened to me isn't what I experienced during those 2 days in October. It's knowing that whatever I encountered is still out there. It's knowing that it exists in a place I've completely avoided since my rescue. It's knowing that it made a choice, a deliberate, intelligent choice to let me live. And sometimes, in the months after my rescue, I would get phone calls at 3 in the morning. The calls would show up on my caller ID, but it was always my own number calling me. When I answered, there was nothing but breathing on the other end. Breathing and, if I listened carefully, the sound of distant howling. I've stopped answering those calls. I've also noticed that in crowds, sometimes I see people who look familiar. People who look like they have my mannerisms, my gestures, my expressions. People who seem to be watching me, then disappear into the crowd before I can get a better look. I don't know if this is paranoia or if it's something real. I don't know if I'm being tracked by something or if my trauma is manifesting as patterns where none exist. What I do know is this: there are places in this world that shouldn't be explored. There are things living in those places that don't follow the rules of nature that we understand. And if you venture into the wild, into places where indigenous peoples have left warnings, into territories that are supposed to be untouched and pristine, you need to understand that you might not be alone. And you might not be welcome. I survived the autumn hunt, but part of me didn't survive. Part of me is still there, in that forest, hanging from that terrible tree, speaking in that chorus of voices. And sometimes, when the wind blows in just the right way, I swear I can hear myself screaming. In the dead of autumn, when the leaves are falling and the forests are dying, when the boundary between seasons seems thin and permeable, I feel it most strongly. The pull back to those mountains. The knowledge that something is waiting for me there. The certainty that one day, my curiosity or my arrogance or my stubborn refusal to acknowledge the impossible will drive me back to that place. And this time, I don't think I'll be allowed to leave.